The moon race is one of the most memorable events of the 20th century, yet it remains highly controversial. Why does the American flag appear to flutter in a non-existent wind? Or why don't the astronauts' boot prints match the photos? How did an underdeveloped space program manage to send a man to the moon? These arguments from conspiracy theorists who believe in the moon landing hoax remain popular today. Unfortunately, history is merciless and cannot provide a definitive answer to the eternal question: did Americans really land on the moon? Share your opinion in the comments, and let's dive into the facts, starting with some alarming statistics. According to a survey by VTSIOM, 57% of Russian adults believe that the entire lunar mission was filmed on Hollywood sets. Similarly, 1 in 6 Britons and 1 in 10 Swiss citizens hold the same view. Even in the US, about 3% of people genuinely believe they were deceived, claiming the moon landing never happened. The moon conspiracy began in 1968 when an amusing article appeared in the New York Times. Allegedly, in a Chicago bar, a drunk NASA specialist showed his friends a frame from astronaut training exercises that looked remarkably similar to what was presented as footage from the moon. Conspiracy stories always sell well, so within a year, key objections to the official story started to form. We won't delve into the specifics of the moon landing conspiracy movement, as that would only promote less than bright individuals. Instead, we'll focus on the facts. The most argument is that the American flag on the moon appears to be fluttering in the wind in photographs. Since the moon has virtually no atmosphere, there should be no wind. This is a favorite argument of conspiracy theorists who claim the photo was taken on a sound stage here on Earth, where wind in an enclosed space seems perfectly normal. Genius, right? Unfortunately, anyone who paid attention in physics class can easily debunk this myth. Indeed, there is no air on the moon, and the flag planted in its surface would collapse. To prevent this, a horizontal rod was inserted into the top of the flagpole to keep the flag from sagging. As the astronauts were planting the flag, they shook it due to the difficult conditions, causing it to ripple. There is no wind on the moon, but basic vibrations still occur. Shake a towel in a closed room. Does it need wind to form folds? Like any piece of fabric, the flag moved, and it's these movements that people mistake for wind. Restored video footage from NASA as well as photos clearly showing that after being planted, the flag's position didn't change or flutter, serve as a nail in the coffin for this conspiracy theory. Speaking of photos, let's debunk a couple of other myths. In one of the pictures from the moon are stars visible, though you'd expect them to be even brighter without an atmosphere. Here, any photographer can explain the situation. In short, it's about exposure. Turn on selfie mode and face away from the sun. You have two options: either capture a clear face against a blurry background or a beautifully detailed background with a fuzzy face. The same applies to space. If the astronauts had increased the exposure time, they could have shown the stars, but everything on the moon's surface would have been blurry. The photos were taken during the day on the illuminated side of the satellite, and the sun outshone any star. That's why the stars were sacrificed. By the way, this effect can be seen in even the most modern photos from space. Long exposure shots yield beautiful starry panoramas, while short exposure photos of the International Space Station or Earth show no stars at all. Perhaps the most absurd yet popular detail is the famous photo of Buzz Aldrin's footprint on the lunar surface. The footprint clearly shows a pattern that doesn't match the boots on display in museums. Numerous videos have been made about this, and memes of the boot are still circulating online. However, the explanation is simple. When preparing to step onto the lunar surface, Neil Armstrong's team wore spacesuits with extra boots that had wider soles over their regular boots. The gravitational pull of our satellite is much weaker, so wearing shoes with wide soles there is absolutely critical. And those wide soles actually had vertical stripes on them. We hope you now understand how flimsy and insane all the arguments of the moon landing conspiracy theorists are. There are also a lot of minor claims that can be dismissed with basic logic. For example, the claim that solar radiation should have burnt all the photos and the astronauts themselves. But 10 years before Neil Armstrong, the Soviet spacecraft Luna 3 took photos of the moon without any issues, and it did so using captured American film that was resistant to radiation. To doubt that this technology, developed by the US in the 1950s, wasn't available to Apollo 11 in 1969 is utter nonsense. As for the astronauts, the explanation is even simpler. The spacecraft was well shielded, and inside the Gemini 11 capsule, radiation levels were only about 0.2–0.3 rad per hour, which is not a huge amount. Even after this, moon landing conspiracy theorists are not satisfied. They aren't convinced even by the words of the first person in space, Alexei Leonov, or by Soviet spacecraft designer Boris Chertok, or the leadership of the USSR. The Soviet Union kept a close eye on the landing, and even the slightest hint of a fake would have been blown out of proportion. Yet this doesn't stop people with tinfoil hats. They claim that the USSR and the US made a secret deal where the Soviets would acknowledge the fake landing in exchange for the US not revealing information about the supposed deaths of dozens of Soviet cosmonauts. Considering these two countries were on the brink of starting World War III, it's quite bold to think they were participants in a joint conspiracy, isn't it? It all got even funnier in 2009 when the LRO probe decided to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the moon landing. The space station captured images of the lunar modules, landing sites, and even tracks left by Apollo mission cards. Do you think this was enough to stop the moon landing conspiracy theorists? Not really. The final and most significant argument they present is that since 1972, despite immense technological progress, we have not managed to send another person to the moon. Only now our Apollo-like program starting again, with the first astronauts planned to be sent in about 10 years. This claim seems logical. If Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon in 1969, then surely anyone should be able to do the same after 50 years. But no, NASA has said that a lot of work is still needed, and if everything goes well, we will return to the moon in 2024. Unfortunately, there is a simple explanation here too. In 1966, NASA's budget amounted to almost 5% of the US federal budget. Adjusted for inflation, this is an astronomical figure – $43 billion. That's about as much as Russia currently spends on its entire defense. By comparison, in 2018, NASA received just 0.5% of the federal budget. The space race was extremely costly for Americans, which is why it was abandoned for good. Furthermore, the moon turned out to be far less interesting as a space object than anticipated. Enough lunar soil samples were brought back, and there was simply nothing left to study, except perhaps to use it as a base for Mars exploration, which is exactly what NASA, Elon Musk, and that organization that promised a lunar base by 2015 plan to do. The problem is they will have to start from scratch, as all previous projects have been shelved and put on hold. Now, 50 years later, the old methods need modern equivalents. Scientists are working on this right now. The difference is that space exploration used to captivate the general public, but now people are more excited about new iPhone models, which means space programs are severely underfunded. But soon everything will change, and in this century humanity will return to the moon, followed by Mars. If you have any remaining questions about the moon landing conspiracy, leave them in the comments, and we will definitely address them all. Until next time, friends.